Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. We're going to get started. Can you hear me? Okay. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce Dr. Micheal Merzenich, and he's a native of Lebanon, Oregon, and he's received his BS from Portland University and his PhD in neurophysiology from Johns Hopkins. Following a fellowship at Wisconsin University, he accepted a position at UCSF in 1971, where he was the longtime Francis Soy Professor and director of the John C. and Edward Coleman Laboratory. He has been widely recognized as the co-inventor of the cochlear implant and a major contributor to the fundamental and applied neuroscience of adult brain plasticity. With UCSF's approval, he co-founded Scientific Learning and Posit Science Corporations, world leaders in translating neuroscience out of the laboratory to help grow, sustain, and if necessary, recover brain health in normal and struggling child, adult, and aging populations. His research team's works have been recognized by election to the National Academies of Science and Medicine and by many international awards and prizes. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Shiva. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you today. And I'm a neighbor, so it's always nice to be here with my neighbors. This is sort of annoying. Okay, I want to say at the outset that I am commercially contaminated. So when I talk later about things that, I'm going to talk primarily about things that Posit Science does. I was permitted by the University of California to contribute to the founding of two companies. I was the founding CEO of a company called Scientific Learning, which focuses on problems in children that struggle. And then a founder of a company called Posit Science Corporation, which is headquartered in downtown San Francisco. And it focuses on more severe problems that occur in children, you could say in the medical domain, but also on problems of individuals of all ages that are more neurological and medical. And UCSF permitted me to do this for a long time, for a while. I was the only professor that they allowed to do something like this and not take away their academic position. And they did that because I convinced them that it was not about self-aggrandizement. I also want to say at the beginning that, when I talk about what these companies do, you should understand that I benefit by it, I profit by it in a variety of ways. So you should have appropriate reservations when we get to that point, because that does represent a conflict of interest in what I say. The second thing I want to say is that the science I'm going to talk about is teamwork. It's all team science. Several thousand people have contributed to it. And this includes many other brain scientists, psychologists, medical doctors of all stripes, many people in the front lines of therapy and psychological and other support, many technologists. So I'm here in a sense as a representative of a very large number of people who have conducted research in many places in the world that both in the development of the sort of strategies I'm going to talk about and the demonstration or the evaluation of their effectivenesses. And finally, I want to say that this science is very, very complicated. There are hundreds of thousands of scientific reports that relate to the fact that the brain is continually changing itself as a function of how we engage it. And that's really what I'm going to talk about. The brain is fundamentally plastic. It's changing continuously in life. And basically one of the things that we've been dedicated to do in our research, in my scientific life, has been to try to harness this genie to control the brain change, you could say, to the benefits of people that struggle. And but the science is very complicated. I can only talk to you about it in a relatively superficial way. So think about it, this is a kind of introduction. I'm going to add a final comment. My final comment is that I disagree with almost everything the previous speaker said about Alzheimer's disease and the progression and loss and about what you should do about it. So that doesn't mean to say I'm right and he's wrong, but I'm going to present a sort of contrarian view to what he said. It represents a different perspective, you could say, coming from a different domain, equally intense and valuable and serious in neurological science. So not too many years ago, and in fact up to about 20, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, the predominant belief was that the brain was plastic when you're a baby and it grew up. That is to say that plasticity did apply, the brain was changing itself in early life, in early childhood. And then at the sort of end stage of development of that embryological development, the brain grew up and reached a mature state or mature form, and its connectivity was established for life. Not just its connectivity, but it's believed that all of the elements in the brain, the neurons, the nerve cells that are controlling neurological processes also grew up, reached a mature state. And beyond that point, you could think of the brain as being like the computer on your desk, hardwired, fixed and reliable, like a machine, unchangeable to the end of life. And in fact, such a hardwired machine really only had one thing that could happen to it from that point forward, from the point of view of change, and that was to deteriorate. So before you entered the schoolhouse door, it was believed your brain had reached a mature state. And from that point forward, you had to account for what it did, for what it accomplished, on the basis of the operations that applied, mysterious algorithms that applied in that fixed machine, like that computer on your desk. We now know that nothing could be further from the truth. We now know that the brain, in fact, is continually remodeling itself on a massive scale. We now know that there are many quadrillions of moments of change in a brain in a life, and that those changes actually account for the origin of your reconstruction of the world that you've created in your brain, and of the control of your operations within it. And it's accomplished by virtue of the brain changing itself, of course, as a function of your experiences. So every one of us has a different passage in life. And from that different passage in life, through these quadrillions of moments of change, it differentiates the machinery in the brain to specialize it in all kinds of ways, adaptively, as a function of our own individual experiences and cultural references. So, and one of the beautiful things about this process is that because of the complexity of these self-induced changes, this self-organization that's occurred in every one of us, it spectacularly differentiates one from the other. So every one of us, not just on the basis of the differences of our own passage across the planet and in society, across the period of our development, also because of all of these unique internal operations and thoughts and things that have occurred within us. It differentiates one from another, every one of us, in a sense, creating a unique machine within our skull. No other person has had ever, oh, that's very hard. Really, I almost have to eat the damn thing. No one else has one just like ours. That machine inside your skull is unique to you. There never will be another one just like yours, never has been. You see the lady on the lower right, and you see that she's weaving a basket. And you can ask yourself, well, could a person of this age acquire the ability to learn to weave a basket, or could she improve at this ability at her age? And you know instinctively that you could probably teach somebody of her age to do this, and she could be in a class, and in that class, I bet there are classes like this here at the JCC where you could improve in an ability like this. And because we know that all improvement of all skill and ability is actually a consequence of brain remodeling, we know that her brain is still plastic. Plasticity is a brain's big trick, and in fact, it's a lifelong resource. Now, am I looking at that screen and I'm seeing the message always cut off on the left side? In the end, this is probably going to be somewhat of a disaster. Maybe I should have adopted Dr. Weiner's strategy of just not showing any slides, because I'm going to have a lot of messages cut off at the left. So I want you to use your high intelligence, okay, your intuitive sense, okay, be alert now, fill in that left side. And actually, maybe you can make more intelligible and intelligent statements than I have. It might work out best for everybody. It's a lifelong resource. Now, through brain change, you've actually acquired and refined all of the special skills and abilities that define the unique person that is you. Now, here's an ability that everyone in this room probably has acquired, or almost everyone, and that's the ability to read. We're looking down at the brain of about 20 readers. This is from a study that was conducted in collaboration with scientists from Stanford about 15 years ago. And I've highlighted several areas on the brain in individuals in the act of reading to show that the brain, in a sense, has been distorted in its activity patterns in somebody that's acquired this ability. And that distortion is reflected by these higher spots of activity, and there's 6 or 7 in the brain of an active reader that you could identify. And you could look at any one of these, this new pattern of activity in the brain as the child is reading, and you can associate those areas of new or exaggerated activity with critical aspects of reading. So, for example, this more posterior area, the area to your right, circled by green, is the area in which the fundamental translation between the sound parts of words that bear meaning in words is translated by those squiggles that we call letters. So reading is a translation at high speed of the sound parts of words that bear meaning in words to orthographic or letter-based representation. Basically, we make this translation initially very haltingly, very slowly, and then at higher and higher speed, we're making this translation on the fly, and pretty soon the eyes are whipping across the page, and we're making this translation with great facility and accuracy. The reading is a translation of sound to a visual representation of sound in writing on the page. This more anterior area, and I just decided to highlight a second area that's obviously important in reading, we know that the activity in this area is very strongly correlated with the correct identification of the written meaning of words. So these are 2 of the 5 or 6 areas. I could have highlighted others in a brain map like this. These exaggerations, of course, have arisen plastically as a consequence of the hundreds of hours, of thousands of hours of practices that a kid getting to this point, mastering this basic active reading. And if I look at children that can't read, and on the bottom I see 20 children that are matched to the children above, 20 children that can't read, of course I see no such activity. Okay, they have not developed the reading brain, of course. Now, actually, I can train the great majority of children that can't read to read by intensively training them on a computer for about 18 to 20 hours. Most children that can't read can be trained to read effectively by training them on a computer for 18 to 20 hours. And when I do that, I see activity emerge in these areas, again, that are circled. Now we see in the more posterior circle, we see a strong pulse of activity, that little red spot just below it, the circle. That occurs in every child that's initially making this sound to letter translation. And actually, we know if we looked at about 2 to 3 months later, all of that activity would be right up in the circle, just as it is in a typical accomplished reader. We see we already have a very strong emergent source of activity in this more anterior zone. All of these children could read at grade level or above within a few months after the completion of this training, but not immediately, because none of these children were trained to read. Now, they were actually trained as listeners to improve the way their brain resolved the sound parts of words. And the reason is because the reason most children can't read is because their brain does not, in fact, represent the sound parts of words in adequate detail, in the normal, highly detailed way that is required for the translation of those sounds to letter to make sense to the brain or to the child. That's another way of saying that you need to understand enough about the elemental neurology to know what to fix or how to repair a brain. You need to know what the underpinnings of a behavior are, not just the most superficial aspects of it. So in other words, if I think about what it means to lose my memory, it's not because, I do not lose my memory because I lost an understanding what remembering is. and practice remembering is not going to recover it. What neurologically underlies my ability to record information reliably and accurately? And how do I need to exercise the brain and actually to drive such a corrective change? And this applies to every aspect of how we would think about correcting our neurology to recover our faculties or abilities. Now, we've actually trained more than 6 million children using these strategies, and most of those children, about 85% of them, that have been unsuccessful readers have acquired the gift of reading, you could say, by training with this level of intensity. Now, you've actually acquired hundreds of skills and abilities by changing your brain in this kind of way. And those cumulative changes define the operational person that you are. It defines the things, that domain of things that you can do, that you are good at, and also, in a sense, defines your limitations. Every one of us is massively specialized by the culture, by the circumstances, by modern life, by life in general, by our passage in it that is special to us at this moment of time and this time of history, in the circumstances in which we've grown up in it, and our brain has been modified by it massively to define the person that we are, that we held within our skulls. Now, like your physical body, your brain needs exercise to sustain high function, to grow it, and to sustain it. And it needs exercise to sustain its organic health. We know that brains vary in their resilience to things. Many things can fall this. Commonly the term that people use to define this resilience is cognitive reserve. We know that if you have a lot of cognitive reserve, whatever other circumstances befall you, you're in a pretty safe position from the point of view of being relatively less risk of falling off a cliff into a condition like Alzheimer's disease. And that cognitive reserve we know stems from very active brain use and differentiates healthy from unhealthy brains. Now, we've tried to extensively study the neurological basis of cognitive reserve. And we tried to ask the key questions: what forms of brain exercise are actually most useful for growing your brain power? What is the brain asking us to do, you could say, in a more general sense, to grow your brain power? And what exercises are most important for keeping you safer, that is to say, for keeping you more resilient against an end-of-life catastrophe? And our answer to these questions, and this is commercial again, this is the commercial side, is Brain HQ. And I'm going to try to explain to you how it's designed and what it's designed to do and why it's designed to do that from a scientific perspective. Now, before I do that, I want to talk about evidence that documents a key aspect of the processes that express neuroplasticity, which you're probably unaware of. And that's the fact that God or Mother Nature created these processes to be inherently reversible. Brain plasticity is inherently reversible. And that's another way of saying that I could take any one of you and I could train you, and over a period of 2 or 3 weeks of training, progressive training, I could turn your hand into a useless claw. Absolutely no control over the functional use of your right or left hand. You choose which one, I'll do the training. Or I could train any one of you. And I could very significantly improve your ability to use your hand, your right or your left hand, as a more powerful instrument in manipulation or controlling tools or whatever. Plasticity is a two-way street. It's just as easy to drive the brain in a negative as in a positive functional direction. I could take any one of you, and by training you, I could quite easily destroy, this would take 4 or 5 or 6 weeks, your ability to understand what I'm saying. Or I could take any one of you, and I could train you, and I could quite highly significantly improve your ability to understand what I'm saying, even under very difficult circumstances. Plasticity is bidirectional. Now, we understood this, we began to understand this more than 20 years ago, when we conducted studies largely in monkeys, in which we were studying the rules that govern plasticity. And we realized that as we defined the rules, if we followed the rules, we could drive changes in either a positive or negative direction at will. Because plasticity is rule-based, the processes that govern it are based upon rules that we understand how to control it, you could say, for good or for ill. But an important implication of this is that negative change is a part of a natural life. It's not unnatural. The brain is designed to change negatively under certain circumstances. And there's a reason or a purpose for this, what I'm going to talk about in a minute. Now, about 12 or 13 years ago, working with a brilliant young fellow working in my laboratory before I left UCSF, and you can see this handsome man on the far left of your screen. He's actually a very, very good-looking fellow. Etienne de Villers-Sedani is his name. He's an associate professor now in the Neurological Institute at Micheal University in Montreal. And he and I decided to look at this bidirectional plasticity more richly and by asking a further question. And the further question is, beyond these functional aspects of brain change, how many aspects or dimensions of the physical, functional, chemical brain are actually changing negatively or positive, can actually be changed negatively or positively as a function of how we engage it. So I made a long list of things. The initial list was 17. We've now gotten to past 30, and looking at 30 different physical, chemical, and functional dimensions of brain operations, you could say, primarily focusing on the cerebral cortex. And the first thing we asked was, well, how many, and I'll show you what these are in a minute. We asked how many of these 17 things are different in an animal that's really struggling as contrasted with an animal that's in the, you could say, the fit, prime condition that we'd normally see in a young, healthy adult. And we've actually done this experiment in 3 models. The first is comparing animals in the prime of life, the most capable, young, vigorous animal, and contrasting their neurological status in these 17 indices with an animal near the end of life. We've also asked the same question about animals that were given a really terrible early childhood. And then we've contrasted the state in these 17 things with an animal that's had a normal, active childhood. The third model, we've actually looked at animals that have the equivalent, although we didn't actually physically concuss them, but they had the equivalent of repeated concussions. So you could think of it as diffuse brain damage across big reaches of the brain. And as a consequence of this diffuse brain damage, again, we're looking at the consequences of this, contrasting those animals with other young, vigorous adults who have not been concussed. In every case, we look at the 17 things, again, extended now to more than 30 things. And the first question you can ask, now, let's look at an animal near the end of life, expected to die in a month or so. How many of those 17 things do you think, or 20, 30 things, do you think might be different from an animal in the prime of life? And the answer is all of them. Everything's different. Significantly different, substantially different. The second question you can ask, and again, I'm going to tell you what some of these things are in a minute. You could ask, well, how many of those things advantage the older brain? And the answer is none of them. Older is slower, less reliable. Older is degrading, it's dying off. Older is deteriorating, downregulated. Everything you look at, younger is better, older is poor. And the difference is substantial. Kind of discouraging, isn't it? And then we ask the real question. The real question. How many of these things can we impact by engaging the animal in appropriate forms of training? And how complicated will that training have to be? And the simple answer is everything is reversible. Every one of these 17, now extended to more than 30 indices of brain health, in fact, is reversible. And most of the characteristics in an animal near the end of life can be carried back to closely match the performance or functional or physical characteristics of an animal in the prime of life. Not just reversible, but dramatically reversible. Now, I might say that when we did these experiments, we found another really interesting thing occurred at the end of this study. And that was that the animals that were trained that were expected to die roughly at the time of the end of training weren't about to die. They were feisty again. They wanted to bite us again. They were full of it again. So we asked a simple question. If we just keep a couple of these animals alive with no more training, how long will they live? We found that we'd extended their life in these two animals that we kept alive by about 40%. And my colleague, Etienne Villers-Sedani, has been studying this ever since. And he's asking the question in another way. He's been asking the question, how long can I keep animals alive by continuously training them? Because in this case, at extending 40%, we train them no more. And the answer is that it's a very long study. Still ongoing. Still ongoing. And will be ongoing for a while because the majority of the animals in his trial are still alive. So what are these things that I'm talking about? And I want to say one more thing. In order to drive these changes, it takes two different forms of training. I see that the left, oh, that's all right. We can kind of read that left column, can't we? That's lucky. It takes two different forms of training. One training, basically, you can think of as recovering the resolving power of the machinery of the brain from the bottom. The brain has degraded resolving power from the bottom. It's no longer operating reliably in resolving information in fast time in fine detail. It's no longer representing information in a highly organized and correlated way. Teamwork is low. So its representational operations at the bottom are poor. And actually, relatively simple forms of training can restore this capacity, and we can see it restored to normalcy in these animals by intensively training. The second form of training requires that you engage the brain from the top. You must re-engage the brain to control information in memory, to keep information, you could say, in mind while it operates on it, under conditions in which, again, information can be highly resolved and not very subject to the interference of distractors or other information in that operational level of the brain. It has to operate at speed and with fidelity in the top, at speed and recovered fidelity in the bottom. This can be accomplished by two relatively simple forms or dimensions of training. And when you do that, what happens is the brain remyelinates. The myelin is the insulation in the fibers of the brain. And older brains do not make new myelin. They stop it. And myelin gradually, progressively, so the wires are losing their myelin. And this is basically dramatically reducing the speed of operations in brain systems. And that's substantially recovered if the training dosing is right, it completely recovered in an old trained brain. You recover response power. You recover response coordination, which is conferring functional reliability. You could say the greater the coordination, the greater the teamwork, the more reliable the brain is in its operations. Specific neuronal types are recovered in their numbers, and they also again look like the neurons that we'd expect to see in these critical neuron types that you'd see in a young animal. This is one of those forms of neuron. This neuronal population is particularly important for controlling coordination in brain systems. This particular population has contributed critically to plasticity, controlling change or plasticity itself. Pyramidal cells are the primary neuronal type in the cerebral cortex, and dendritic branching is reflecting the capacity of the brain to represent information in elaboration and in detail. Cortical thalamic, these are the inputs to brain areas, and the elaboration of the branching or the spreading of inputs that are coming into the brain basically is supporting plasticity or change of the brain in an enriched and positive way. We see these are cells that are supporting the brain in a variety of ways in the vascularization of the brain. We see young brain chemistry restored. It's very different in an old animal. It's back to the young brain form again. We see brain speed recovered by several indices. We see orderliness in the way the brain is representing information restored. We see the functional units of the cerebral cortex are back to their normal size. They're bloated and imprecise in their structural operations and their operations in an old animal. We see complex feature selective responding recovered. We see trophic factors that are controlling the growth process of the brain recovered. We see a whole series of things. Everything we look at is restored by training to a youthful level. We've repeatedly shown that specific forms of brain exercise grow brain power and restore neurological integrity in normal and in struggling adults. What you'd see in the left is that the brain of a young animal is making lots of myelin. The brain of an old animal is making none. and the brain of an old trained animal is making lots again. And in fact, if you simply control the dosing, an old brain is making just as much as a young, vigorous, healthy brain. This is the second dimension, and I use it because it's something very different that you wouldn't think of as being plastic. This relates to the health of the vascular relationship of the vasculature to the brain, to the tissues of the brain. And one of the things that the brain does is it has a special strategy for sealing off the vascular compartment, you could say blood vessels and their fluids, from the tissues of the brain. And it's doing this for two main reasons. The first reason is because the ionic constituencies, the agents in blood, actually interfere with the excitability in brain tissues. Brain tissues are very electrically excitable. And if the ionic constituents in blood can get into brain tissue, they add to local brain noise. And local brain noise basically is degrading, it's disorganizing. So the first reason why this barrier is important is because it's basically preserving the brain as protected from those ionic species. The second main reason that the barrier is critical is because when it leaks, there's a possibility for infection agents from blood to enter brain tissue. And brain tissue is easily immunologically compromised by having viruses or bacteria enter brain tissue. It has relatively poor in-place strategies for fighting them off. Basically, it fights them off, just so you know. An elemental thing it does is it coats an invading virus or bacterium with a protein called amyloid. And actually, the primary reason or basis of the formation of amyloid bodies is to wall off an infectious agent that could damage the brain if it's allowed in entering the brain to proliferate, to multiply and proliferate. Well, you can look at the second critical aspect of this neurovascular unit integrity is that it's actually controlling what we call reactive hyperemia, or that's the nutritional supply to the brain, to each little brain area as a function of the underlying activity in the area. So the brain has this wonderful ability to regulate its local blood flow as a function of how active the processes are just underneath those blood vessels. And basically it releases those nutrients, you could say it exaggerates that blood flow as needed. This goes to hell when you're older, goes to hell in an old brain. The response in reactive hyperemia, the lack of response is a signature deficit that's been demonstrated to occur as the brain progresses in the path towards dementia or Alzheimer's disease. So it's important to have the integrity of this neurovascular unit be in good stead. Here we're looking at a young animal, and it's intact, and that's indicated by no movement of this dyad, this marker, coming from this capillary into the surrounding brain tissue. You look at a typical capillary in an old animal, it's very leaky. That's what all of this background color is. And that it completely reseals in an old brain. It doesn't look, that's not totally convincing by the same example, but if I look at 100 of these examples, I can see that it's completely resealed by training an animal at an old age. Here's a third example, and here again we have the misfortune of cutting off the critical panels on the far right. What we just see in the upper panel, you'd see lots of cells in a young animal, labeled for these parabubulin inhibitory neurons, certain class of critical brain cells. You'd see very few of them here, handful, about 1/10 as many, and you'd see a complete recovery here. Boy, isn't this a wonderful illustration of that? So, look, what did we do? We looked initially at 17, ultimately more than 30 things, physical, functional, chemical things. And we asked first, are they different in old brains versus young brains? Are they different in brains that have had terrible childhoods versus brains that have had normal early life? Let's say those two populations, and everything's different. Both populations, everything's different. Everything you could interpret in the animal that's struggling, you could say favors the animal that's had the healthy life, the normal life. Disadvantages the brain that's struggling. Everything is reversible. Every dimension that we would say relates to the functional capacities and the health of this organ, everything that we look at is reversible. Well, how many things do we have to look at before we come to the conclusion that it's all reversible? So we look at 17 things, then 30 things, and we find nothing that is not pretty much completely reversible. That's another way of saying it's designed to be reversible. It's designed for whatever reason, we'll talk about a reason in a minute, to be reversible. So how do you turn an old brain, an impaired brain, into a functionally more capable, a younger one? How do you keep it safer? How do you restore its organic health, you could say? Well, you train it. It's important that you train it in particular ways. Neurological rejuvenation will only be achieved with particular forms of training. And brain HQ exercises are specifically designed to achieve that rejuvenation. Okay? What are we trying to do in brain HQ exercises? From the bottom, we're trying to improve the resolving power, to recover the resolving power of the brain at speed and in detail in all of your operations in listening and in vision. And from the top, we're trying to train you to hold information in mind while you're challenged by a series of interfering stimuli, progressively improving your ability to resolve that information held in working memory while you operate on it to do all kinds of things under the control of mind, from mind-generated or your brain-generating processes and operations. That's exactly what we're trying to do. So, well then how do you turn a brain in the prime of life into an old one? Well, to put it another way, why the hell does it go to hell? So, it's actually a very easy experiment to do. It's actually very easy to, I could take any one of you. Anybody want to volunteer for an accelerated aging experiment? All you need to do is just add noise. And by noise, I mean noise into the processes of the brain itself. I'm not talking about necessarily turning on the noise machine. I'm talking about adding noisiness to the process of the brain itself. The way to think about it is the brain basically is always resolving what you're seeing or hearing or feeling or thinking against the background of electrical noise, of chatter. And the more it can control its signal as clear signal processor, the less there's an interference from that chatter, the better it's going to be. So it turns out if you, by a variety of ways, we use two different strategies. We've manipulated processes in the brain artificially by manipulating the inhibitory process of the brain, and noise rises everywhere in the brain. 4 or 5 or 6 weeks later, the brain looks like an animal that's about to die. Every one of these dimensions has gone straight south, straight to hell. Or we've also just injected acoustic noise in the auditory brain. We can just keep the noise on continuously at a high level, at a level just below the level that damages the inner ear itself. Never off, always on. And what that just does is disallows, first of all, it pounds the brain with that disorganized activity that has no meaning. And by pounding it, it basically carries the auditory machinery of the brain so that pretty soon the machinery looks like the machinery of an animal about to die. It's very easy to advance this process by adding noise. We say, well, what's the source of that noise in the average older life? Where's that noise coming from? Well, where it comes from is how you lead your life. Before we talk about that, I want to say a little bit about what the negative side of plasticity is all about. Why did, you could say, that Mother Nature endow us with this particular property? Our reversible plasticity is actually designed to assure that we sustain overall neurobehavioral control. It's all about getting the answer right. The way plasticity is controlled, it's controlled as a function of outcome. And when we get the answer right, basically, consistently, the brain advances. If we're consistently correct, our machinery advances its powers. Okay? However, if we consistently are on an unacceptable level, if we begin to fail, our machinery actually relaxes its time constants and its space constants to take longer. As it looks more carefully, be certain that it's not making a mistake. It's all about sustaining control. I might say in relation to this, for an older person, this is sort of unfortunate because everyone in this room is sustaining on some level the control of their operations in life. That does not mean your brain is healthy because there's a great latitude in the actual performance characteristics of the brain that is afforded by this processes of making adjustments to the brain so you sustain elemental control. It's a gift, basically, to still have a basic control of our operations, to get the answer right for most of the things that matter to us. But it can be deceptive from the point of view of the actual status of our brain health. Older individuals sustain basic control of their operations, even when their brain is usually slowly using its youthful high-speed, high-accuracy prowess. Again, we have the power to control whether the brain shall advance or retreat, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute. Remember, on the turn of a dime, we engaged an old rat. It's clearly going to hell, functionally, physically, and not so far away from leaving this mortal coil. We changed everything together, and everything went back in the correct direction. And on the turn of a dime, we took an animal that's completely vigorous and healthy, and we drove it straight into the ditch. You could say there's a kind of master switch, and we have the control, understanding these processes, we understand how to throw the switch. It's really advisable that you understand this, and you understand how you could throw that switch in a positive direction. So what's the source of all of that chatter in normal aging? Well, one way to think about it is to think about this guy. And this guy's mastered the use of a tool, and this complex tool he's an expert at using. This could really come from tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of hours of intensive practice. And to sustain his ability to high level, what does he have to do? He has to continue to practice. He has to practice an hour, 2, 3, 4 hours every day to sustain his ability on the highest levels. Well, what happens if he stops practicing? Well, within a month, everyone would notice. Why is Bill not practicing? You know, they could hear the difference. The differences would be subtle to us, maybe unrecognizable to us, but not from other experts. What if Bill didn't practice for a year? Well, he'd probably have lost his job. Everyone would understand that he's no longer maintaining his abilities truly on a professional level. What if he didn't practice for 10 years? Well, he could probably still make us cry by playing his violin for us, and we would love it, but no one would really mistake him for a true professional anymore. What if Bill's decided, after not practicing for 10 years, to reinitiate training, to try to recover his professional career? Would Bill have a chance? And the answer is he would probably have a chance to accomplish that by a period of intensive practice, because there are many examples in the history of music in which exactly that has occurred. And it's people, by reinitiating practice, have come to even a higher level of performance and ability and achievement. Well, why have you stopped practicing? And you had a childhood, you had an early life that was just chock full of learning and the development of skills and abilities and refinement and progressive refinement that created the operational person that you are. And then, if you're like the typical average adult human being, you started resting on your laurels. Or to put it another way, you see yourself as an operational person, largely now interested in more abstract and complicated things in life, and no longer so interested in the details or the accuracy in which you're receiving or manipulating information in your brain as you were as a child. So basically, in some sense, the task is to recover those capacities that reflected you, that drove your abilities to that peak when you were at that peak, usually in about the third decade of life. So here's another reason. We call it growing older, growing noise in the older brain part 2. The average citizen of the United States spends 11 hours a day sitting in a chair. Generally, that's not the very best way to drive changes in what you're seeing or hearing into action. They spend about the equivalent amount of time looking at a screen. They look up the way to, say, going to visit a neighbor. They spend themselves totally enraptured in the disconnection on their devices. They look up the answer to everything. So basically, all of these represent, you could say, organized strategies for neurological withdrawal. The deprivation that's inherent in this for us and for our machines. Our machines need exercise. And basically, they're denied it by how we live our life in so many ways. Now, there are actually hundreds of other vicissitudes across the course of life that can add to the noisiness of your brain. So one of the most discouraging things I heard in the last exercise was that Alzheimer's disease and dementia are fundamentally inherited. Well, you do not want to have the APOE4 gene. You do not want to have it. It'd be better not to have it. But what you should understand is that there are another 100 or so things that contribute very substantially to the risk of an earlier onset of dementia. So here's some of those things. I just made a little list. Maybe some of you have some of these things. Okay, but I could have made this, I could give you 2 or 3 slides like this, right? Abnormal in an older individual is normal. We have vicissitudes in life that add to the risk of really, really serious problems. So whether you have had these things in your life or not, the majority of people have. And basically, they're adding to your neurological burden. All of these things plausibly contribute to an increase of the noisiness of the process of the brain, to that brain chatter. So we can throw the plasticity switch in a growing, I call it a blastic or a destructive, or I call it a clastic direction at will. Coordinated positive performance enhancing organic brain health strengthening changes can be driven by throwing the switch up. And that's by appropriate exercises, you could say, that re-engage the brain to drive these neurological corrections in the machinery of the brain that are contributing to all of these factors of brain health. Or if we want, throw the switch down. That would be sort of a silly voluntary thing to do. But if you do that, you'll have coordinated negative response to performance degrading organic brain health compromising changes will occur in your brain. You can count on it. So we've tried to achieve the driving the brain in a plastic or corrective direction using neurologically optimized brain exercise programs delivered on computers, pads, and smartphones. And the exercises are designed to be adaptive. There's a website called BrainHQ. In that sense that they individualize performance so that you can reach a level, you can find a performance a challenge that's on a level of where you can get most of the answers right. It's critical you always get most of the answers right. So the software has to self-adjust so that you're always challenged, but you're always going to get most of the answers right. It's optimized for rapid gains on the basis of a large body of neuroscience and behavioral science. It's targeted to recover these key abilities to renormalize brains organically and functionally. It's extensive because you have to rejuvenate all brain system levels in all affected domains. It's continuously validating outcomes because we want to measure your performance every time you complete an exercise to set a target for basically driving your performance, you could say, to a more powerful or effective level. It's proven to work. It's very irritating to hear the statement that programs like this have not been validated, or not adequately validated, or haven't been replicated. Actually, the strategies that we apply have been replicated more than 30 times in senior populations in random assigned control trials. How many damn replications do you need? Clinically monitored, if you need to be monitored, many people have struggles in which a clinician should be in place, should be helping you control the delivery of the training, and it's scalable. I'm getting some kind of signal. Does that mean I'm short on time? Well, I'm sorry. I'm going to take a little more time. Okay. So I said it before, speed of processing, or the speed of brain operations, is one of these 30 things, one of these 17 things that you see decline. And if you look from the prime of life in roughly 20th, 30th birthday, speed of processing is one of these things going down. And you can see that I have 5 or 6 other things going down in that same function. This is from a large study of about 3,000 people. Vocabulary is going up, but everything else is going down. Vocabulary is a placeholder for knowledge. Knowledge grows in the brain as you get older, but everything else about the functional operations of the brain goes down. Reasoning goes down. Spatial visualization goes down. Episodic memory goes down. I could show you 30 things that go down with speed of processing, right? Speed of processing is a sort of placeholder. Means your brain is deteriorating, and with its deterioration, all of these things are declining together. Now, I might say that if you have lots of resilience, there are individuals that are sort of at the top of the distribution whose line will be much above this. The other people that are really struggling, whose line will be much below this. This is just the grand average. You'd like to be on a higher trajectory, on a higher plane, not falling off the cliff quite so rapidly. All of those declining abilities can be rejuvenated at any age by brain training. Now, here's an example of a brain training exercise in which that's applied. I illustrate it because I'm going to show a little bit more about it in just a second, where a person is making a decision about what they're seeing in the center of gaze right in front of their eyes, that they see a little truck or car in this level, and then they have to see what they see in the periphery of vision, and they have to remember that, and they have to recognize where this other thing is occurring. And it's easy when you start. Remember, it's designed so that you get most of the answers right when you start, but pretty soon it gets more and more difficult, and pretty soon you're making errors, and pretty soon it's devilishly difficult. Things are occurring so fast and they're so challenging, because the only way you can accomplish this at a high level is if your brain is operating at high speed. When you go to a higher level, not only are those stimuli occurring at high speed, but there are other cognitive load issues in play. In this case, there's lots of other distracting stimuli that occur that you have to separate in confusion from that Route 66 sign. And then the vehicles are a little more confusable, the background is a little bit more confusable, and so forth. Now, there's 60 levels in this game. And if you go from the initial level to the final level, in the final level, the field is full of distractors. The background is very confusable with the targets. Things are occurring at lickety-split speed. If you go from the initial level to the highest level, you're a master at controlling what you see in front of you at speed and accuracy, okay? Now, it turns out that if you look at performance on a task like this, you see that in individuals before they're trained, these are individuals between the age of 20 and 100, and you can see that older is poorer in humans just as in rats. So there's a very systematic decline in performance and processing speed as a function of age. And now you train everybody to the equivalent extent. This is about 5 to 6 hours of training, and you can see that everybody improves about equivalently. Everybody's improving to about the same extent. And you can see that one of the reasons that occurs is because the training is specifically designed not just to train this ability in processing speed, but also to recover the machinery that's controlling rates of change in your brain by training. Now, it turns out that processing speed is an important indicator of all of these 30 things. It's an important indicator of all of these behavioral things that we know decline as a function of age. Now, if we just look at an individual at 75 years of age, and now they've been trained for the 5 or 6 hours, and we compare their processing speed with the processing speed of individuals before they're trained, we see that now the trained 75-year-old's performance is equal to an untrained 20-year-old. We see this in almost every index of performance in almost every elemental task like this. You can drive the fundamental operational characteristics of the brain at any age to the characteristics that apply to a brain in the prime or not so far away from the prime of life. Now, it's important to understand that performance gains in these abilities actually reflected all of these rejuvenating changes that must have occurred. Now, finally, I want to talk about a specific example in which this very task has been used in a longitudinal trial that was conducted in 3,200 individuals called the active trial. And 750 of these individuals were trained on this task that I just showed you. And as a consequence of that training, initially they had a dramatic improvement of processing speed. So this is the initial consequences of training. A year later, their processing speed was re-examined, and they retained it. They were still as fast as they were before they were trained. And actually, half of these individuals were given a booster shot of 2 to 4 hours. This initial training was 10 hours. 10 hours on the computer, half of them get 2 more. Another year passes, and they look again, and they see that it's essentially retained, still fast. They've gone from their 74th to their 76th birthday on the average. Another year passes, and they still retain it. At this point, this group that got this booster shot is given another 2 to 4 hour booster. So now that one set of these individuals have gotten 10 hours, the other point 14 to 18 hours. 2 years pass, no more training. 2 years pass, processing speed is still retained. 5 years pass, now they're 84 on the average. Processing speed is still higher than when they began, still very strongly differentiated from controls. Controls have significantly deteriorated. So what happened in these individuals across this 10 years? They had half as many traffic accidents. They had far safer driving, as illustrated in a variety of ways. They had reliably sustained their driving mobility. They still had their driver's licenses. They had more confident, effective driving. They drove more than twice as far in distance on the average, even though they had less than half as many traffic accidents. But clearly it had a real-world impact on how they were using their vision actively, you could say. They had improvements of everyday performance abilities. They were faster in performing everyday performance abilities in almost everything measured. They had protection against senior depression. They had better sustained independence, better health, better quality of life. They had less everyday functional difficulty across 10 years. And they had a 48% reduction in dementia incidence if they were in this 14 to 18 hour, one 10-hour, then two booster, one at year 1, one at year 3. This is the only trial in the history of the world in which in a randomized controlled trial, there's been a demonstration that a person could do something, anything, and it's actually demonstrated in an RCT setting that there's a constant reduction in the incidence of dementia. Now, if you'd only trained for 10 hours, 10 years before, the reduction of dementia was 33%. Now remember that in this study, there was no attempt made to manage the health of these individuals. No one was measuring whether or not the driving the corrections of processing speed was strong in everybody or remained strong. That's totally within our ability to do. We now have the capacity to drive people, you could say, so the brain is operating as if it's at a more youthful level and keep them there. Would that increase the probability of protection beyond 48%? I'd bet my house it will, a lot more. So there are now more than 100 other randomized controlled trials again, and various damage. I'm not going to talk about these because I'm out of time. And I want to say that it's not just about delaying the loss of independence or the onset of dementia and aging. The same strategies are being applied to delay the onset of Parkinson's disease. We're pretty sure that we can see it happening in your future by appropriate simple measures, just like we can see, in a sense, this long progression to, quote, Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is not a disease, by the way. It's not a disease. It's a catastrophic end state. It's a train wreck at the end of a long, slow regression series of changes in which the final changes are especially terminally destructive. Same with Parkinson's disease. It's probably preventable. Delaying the onset of the full prevention of the expressions of Huntington's and other inherited diseases, we have dramatic effects in this. Treating depression, growing resilience against depression, a whole series of things like this. So I'm going to end by just giving you a little unasked for advice. First of all, calibrate yourself. And one way you can calibrate yourself is to go to Brain HQ. But actually, if you read my book, I'm going to give you a reference to my book, which is a source of advice to you if you're interested. It provides other bases of thinking about how you would calibrate yourself. I'm also writing a book, which will be published in about, I'm preparing it to be part of another PBS informative program. And it gives very explicit advice upon how you could calibrate yourself in real life. What you could do in real life, in a sense, to know what the status of your brain health is without going to a website or in other ways. But calibrate yourself. One way you can do that is on Brain HQ. And in Brain HQ, you can see by performing exercises whether your performance in something like brain speed is like a typical 70 or 75 or 80-year-old, or like a 20 or 30 or 40 or 50-year-old. You want it to be like a 20 or 30 or 40-year-old, right? So first start by calibrating yourself. And then drive yourself in training. If you're not near the top of that distribution, drive yourself to a performance level that corresponds to you're having effectively a brain that's operating like it's much younger. I would say at least if you can, try to drive yourself down to a performance level that would be equivalent to what you'd see in a typical untrained 40-year-old. And if you can do that, you're probably 40-year-olds don't develop dementia very often. It's possible that you're relatively safe. Live life to the advantage of your brain. Challenge yourself by seriously improving performance on all of your mastered skills. Don't rest on your laurels. Stop operating an automatic pilot. Re-engage again. Fill your life with a heavy schedule of new learning and new skill development. It's all about continuous elaboration of your neurological skills and abilities. Adopt a charitable and social view of the world. Active social engagement, marked by a charitable outlet, are very important for sustaining a brain healthy and happy life. One of the reasons for that is that the very same machinery that contributes to positive good spirits, that very same machinery is the machinery that's controlling change in the brain itself. Remember, brain is controlling its plasticity on the basis of outcome. An outcome means that you've achieved a goal. Something positive has occurred in your life. Every time you contribute generously to other people or receive generous action, you basically are exercising this machine. Face up to the natural vicissitudes that fall almost every life by actively and aggressively challenging yourself to overcome them. Everybody has these things happen to them. Nutritional completement is a key facet of brain health and maintenance. Organize your life as necessary and supplement your nutrition with your brain health in mind. There are many good guides to this. Physical exercise is another key asset, of course. Smell the roses. Seek out the little surprises. Be like a wild-eyed child again. Get off your chair, off the pavement, live life as if it really mattered. And recalibrate yourself every so often to confirm that you're receiving your brain health goals. Now, you have been given a gift. Every person in this room is given a gift, and the gift is the gift of brain plasticity. You have the power, everyone in this room has the power to be a stronger and better person next month or next week, absolutely on a large scale next year compared to today. If you do not take advantage of this gift, you're just a fool. You should be thinking about your life as not a life of sort of controlled regression. Think of yourself, your life going forward, as a life of continuous growth. How can I be a better and stronger and more effective person? Not how can I forestall and try to keep myself from falling into some disaster like my Uncle Joe did. It's all about continuous growth. It's all about making your life better by engaging your brain to its advantage to make it stronger. So I strongly urge you to think about the brain in this perspective, because that perspective is on the path to a better, stronger, and more effective life. So again, if you want more sort of practical advice about how to live your life to the advantage of your brain, this is one place you can find it. You can find this book easily on Amazon in either electronic or version. You can have one shipped to you. That's probably the easiest way to get a hold of it. And I recommend you read this and take it to heart. Thank you very much.